Hello, everyone, and welcome to Legal IT Insider's webinar on the state of security and compliance in the legal sector. It's great to have, we had a lot of people register for today, perhaps not surprisingly. I'm Caroline Hill, I'm Editor-in-Chief of Legal IT Insider, and I'm joined by a great panel today. You'll be familiar with one of the faces in particular. I'm joined by Colin McArdle, who's Director of New Business Sales, Legal and Professional Services at Advance. Hi, Colin.
Hi, Caroline.
It's nice to have you here. Colin's worked at companies including LexisNexis, Kindleworth, and Ticket. And we're lucky to have Adam Harrison, who's Managing Director at FTI Consulting. And he has 15 years of experience in digital forensics and incident response. Hi, Adam.
Good day, Caroline. Thanks for having me.
No, thanks for being here. Just in terms of your background, you've served as Managing Director of Lodestone Security, and prior to that, you've held several leadership roles in IBM's X-Force incident response practice. So going to be really interested to hear some of your takes. So Colin, you've got the longevity in legal, and Adam, obviously the deep specialism in cybersecurity. So it's great. It's going to be great to sort of combine our heads when we're talking through some of the issues that we've got to discuss today. We're going to be looking at a wide range of things. So we're looking at some of the biggest pain points and concerns for law firms when it comes to cybersecurity. And we're going to be looking, so some of the greatest challenges and perhaps some of the solutions that law firms could but aren't necessarily getting right. So perhaps some of the low-hanging fruit. We're going to be coming on to talk about that. We'll be talking about supply chain. We've obviously seen quite a lot of incidents surrounding supply chain just in the last little while. And that's going to be something I'm interested to get both Colin and Adam's take on. We're going to be looking at compliance, obviously the other half of security, and a little bit around culture. We've got a lot to cover. We're going to be looking at internal and external pressures within firms in terms of tech adoption and perhaps some of the barriers to tech adoption, and what strategies, if we've got time, we're going to be talking about a few of the strategies that you can put in place in order to ensure that you, or to make it easier to remain secure, plus some of the challenges that lie ahead. If you could enable your chat function, if you haven't already, we've all been here, done that before. If you can just enable your chat function, make sure if we make sure that everyone can say hello, please. I'm sure that's already enabled. Hi, yeah, that's enabled. I can see some howdies coming in. If you have questions for Colin and Adam during the session, then I'm sure they'd be more than happy to answer. I'd be really grateful if you would keep it succinct and just indicate if it's a question. If you want to chat amongst yourselves, that's half the fun. Please do. Anything that the panel talk about that you want to chat about amongst yourselves, please do. You know, that's one of the great things about it being live. If you've got a question, I'd be grateful if you just mark it question and keep it relatively succinct, just so that we can focus on getting through the rather enormous agenda and also making sure that we deal with your questions as they come in live. Thank you. That was rather a mouthful of an introduction, but it's great to have you here. So without further ado, let's start with pain points. So I think, Adam, so what do you see as the biggest pain points? You don't just deal with law firms, I know, but obviously we are just focusing on law firms for this webinar. What do you see as being the biggest pain points and concerns for law firms still when it comes to cybersecurity?
Yeah, I think it's the same with the very great majority of businesses. And as you alluded to, law firms are by no means unique. They have the same sorts of challenges as other businesses do when it comes to cybersecurity. What's possibly unique as far as law firms are concerned is the extent to which they're holding, particularly sensitive and privileged information, PII of their customers, and indeed their involvement in significant transactions, and therefore the extent to which they're an interesting target to threat actors who are looking for financial gain. The key thing is the balancing act. So it's using technology as an enabler, but also potentially seeing securing that technology as being a blocker and something that's getting in the way of business. So there's an expectation that businesses will move quickly, that they'll adopt technologies, that they'll find new and novel ways to work with their clients. And it's security trying to keep pace with that both in a world where it's very rapidly moving, and also it might not being allocated the budget or attention that it needs for them to be successful.
Do you think things have changed? So I know the NCSC several years ago said that in terms of the biggest major concerns for law firms, it was phishing, data breaches, ransomware, supply chain. Has anything changed?
There have been changes, certainly, and as we see AI and modern technologies and things coming out, then there are new threats. But it's possibly disappointingly, I think it was 2018 was the first time that the NCSC pushed out their cyber threats to the legal industry, and they actually updated it in the middle of last year, and lo and behold, exactly the same threats were there. And that was, as you say, phishing, data breaches, ransomware. And back in 2018, they'd identified supply chain as being a concern, and it's one of the hardest ones to solve. And it's all over the headlines at the tail end of last year, the impact of a supply chain compromise on law firms and conveyancing firms particularly.
Yeah, we're going to come into the supply chain. I mean, so I had a quick look at the NCSC report from last year, and they said ransomware remains one of the most acute cyber threats. And obviously that's something that we saw very acutely last year, didn't we, in terms of some of the biggest law firm attacks, that was typically ransomware. I don't know if the number was surprising. They said between September 22 and August 23, they received 297 reports of ransomware activity. I thought it'd be higher than that.
I think the disappointing thing is the extent to which they're being told about it rather than the extent to which it's happening, of course. There's only a proportion of reporting. There is a chance. I think it's one of the things that the legal sector have done better than others is recognizing, because there is a regulatory component and there's, everyone within a law firm probably has that front of mind. They're better at reporting to the ICO, and they're better at taking their own advice when it comes to sharing information about the fact that they've had an issue. So I think there's probably a reasonable level of visibility there, but certainly, and particularly in smaller firms, it just goes under the radar for the NCSC and law enforcement generally.
Yeah, Colin, with your conversations, from direct experience with working with them, what do you think? Has it changed? What are the greatest challenges, would you say, that law firms are expressing to you currently in terms of remaining secure?
Well, there are a number of things that obviously, for law firms, it's keeping, as Adam mentioned, their sensitive client data as secure as possible. That is at the top of every single law firm's mind as much as possible. So there's that, but there's also then some are expressing, how do they potentially reduce or mitigate human error?
Yeah.
So and that again remains one of the biggest challenges, just in for everybody, whether you're working in a law firm or any other sector for that matter. It's just, how do we educate, how do law firms educate their staff, not just fee earning staff, but all staff? And, how do they keep that education at the forefront of their mind? How do they refresh on that? So those are things that they are absolutely, they are asking for. Those are the things that are causing them the concerns, from day-to-day business.
Yeah, it's interesting because we've had a lot of data breaches, big high-profile ones, but then there was an interesting. I wrote about this actually, but I forget what the source was saying. Remember that a lot of these. The biggest source of breaches from insiders, is as opposed to external attackers. Let's talk about some of the solutions that law firms perhaps could. I was fascinated when we were chatting before this webinar, Adam. You were saying that they aren't getting the basics right. You kind of figure by now, and in light of the threat, that they would be, but they're not, right?
Yeah, and again, I don't want to give law firms a bashing. It's a problem across all industries. But very definitely there are the absolute basics in security hygiene just not being got right. And the nature of these things is there's that many organizations out there. Those who are doing just the bare minimum or a little bit more than the bare minimum are dramatically improving their security posture versus the average and reducing the likelihood that they're going to be impacted. Sorts of things I'm talking about, reducing what's exposed to the internet, what parts of your infrastructure are actually part of your attack service and could be accessed by a malicious actor potentially. Using the security controls, often free, but not necessarily enabled by default, that are available, such as multi-factor authentication, and the things that cyber insurance providers have been harping on about for an extended period of time now. Vulnerable services such as remote desktop and other ways in which you could access an environment that aren't being configured or consistently are being configured badly, reducing those or removing those from your environment to minimize the risk of that initial foothold by a threat actor.
I mean, there's a good point about not bashing. We're not here to bash actually, so I understand it's a massive challenge. I am surprised about the MFA point. In either of your experiences, are most people using MFA, or would you say still not using MFA? Obviously, just law firms.
I think I get a swayed perspective. A huge number of people who come to me with cybersecurity incidents aren't using MFA. So I've got that bias that I'm dealing with incidents, and it's those firms who haven't taken those controls. I think there's probably a good proportion do have it in place, but certainly vast swathes don't. And one of the things, it's not, again, unique to law firms, but is it not being deployed consistently. So you might find that, the average member of staff has MFA because they've been set up by the IT team and they've been configured a certain way, but exceptions are being made for senior people within the business who consider it an inconvenience, or one-off exceptions which are needed for one reason or another that wind up persisting for a period of time. So even in businesses where they've implemented it, it can be inconsistent or not implemented in a way that's as thorough as it could be. And therefore, there's a gap there that a malicious actor can leverage to get in, unfortunately.
That's really interesting. So senior people, let's just come on to that. So senior people, are they one of the sources of perhaps more incidents than others in the firm?
I think it's a mixed bag, but certainly there's a trend there. The old example used to be that we had Windows devices throughout the estate, but the CEO really liked his Mac and so insisted that he had a different computer to everyone else. But lo and behold, none of the security tooling and none of the things that the IT team had put in place to protect the business worked on that individual device. So we see that, time and time again, the idea of sort of shadow IT or secondary IT infrastructure either being stood up by people who want things a certain way, or IT teams being instructed to do things differently for privileged users, commonly people with a bit of clout within the business.
What sort of size firms are we talking? And perhaps I should have asked you at the very beginning, to talk about the sorts of firms that you're seeing. Are they large? Are they small? Are they mixed?
It's across the full spectrum, really. And I think those where you have those kind of exceptions, it's probably the small to medium business. When you get to a level of maturity that you have a security team who've got strong leadership, who can actually push back to other senior execs and say, no, we're not giving you an exception. These have to be done, and this is why. It's those smaller, less well-funded, less resourced IT and IT security practices, teams within businesses that you find in smaller businesses who are probably struggling the most.
Yeah, that's interesting. And Colin, do you see people, training is so obvious, in terms of when you join, how giving people a basic level of training. Are you seeing that happening?
Well, yeah, I think again it's mixed. It's usually, there are unfortunately some organizations, some firms that think as part of the induction process, here's 30 minutes on cybersecurity, if that, and think that is good enough. But it's that ongoing education, whether that, and whereas the attacks may, and sometimes may be more sophisticated, it's actually keeping up to date with those sophisticated methods. Although, for those that that are phished, obviously the overwhelming majority of those are through or via email. So it's that ongoing education. You know, I know that there are some organizations that will have, you know, e-learning in place, you know, a simple 20 to 30-minute course that, you know, all members of staff are due to complete, say, once a year.
Right.
You know,
It's so essential. I mean, but it's so, because it's so hard to spot, even with, you know, we've done some testing on, is this a fake email, is this not? And it's so clever, isn't it? You know, you have to, I think you've got to be so alert to sort of the very subtle differences and the sort of the various ways that you might fall foul of these sorts of things. I would have thought that training would be kind of a basic. If for people listening in, we're going to come on to talk about, I'm going to ask Colin just another question about some of the research that Advanced has done, but we're going to come on to talk about supply chain. So if you've got thoughts on supply chain, if you've been affected by a supply chain incident, either on the receiving end or being involved, then by all means, you know, if you've got any questions, please do post them in advance and we can come on to those. But Colin, I know you've done, so you did some quite interesting research. Advanced did
yeah.
interesting legal trends report, which
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, our legal trends report was just, you know, published you know, within the last week, really. You know, other trends reports are available, but you know, go onto the Advanced website and you know, you'll be able to download it there. But you know, that was across a breadth of firms and organizations where they said 87% of firms felt that their systems, their digital systems, are either secure or very secure. That's great news, you know. But you know, a further 9% were saying, you know, no, not cyber secure. You know what? And then others were saying that one of the key benefits of using that technology in the role is to have confidence that their environment is, you know, is up to scratch. You know, and that was up from 20% across other sectors that Advanced have done. You know, Advanced do a whole business trends, but this one specifically for legal. But you know, there are others who are saying that, you know, although 9% said that their systems are not cyber secure, there was, you know, nearly 20, over a quarter of the respondents felt they are not prepared at all for a cyber attack. You know, and that's obviously quite worrying when you think, what does that equate to? You know, approximately 3,000 firms, law firms in the UK of varying sizes. If you take that 25%, so you know there is that absolute awareness, but it's the actually doing something about it that is proving to be the challenge.
That's high, isn't it? The 26%. Were they the people that answered? Were they? Do you have an insight into
that was across the spectrum of, you know, of all sizes of firms.
Yeah.
You know, so it was, you know, I'll find out in a moment the exact figures.
Yeah, sure.
Right.
It's yeah. I mean, it's high. I think recent events, you know, the types of firms that have been hit recently, very publicly, will be enough to scare quite a lot of people, because they're firms that invest an awful lot in technology. So I'm not revealing anything, you know, obviously Alan Overy very publicly. There's been other firms that have been very publicly hit, and I think that will be cause for real concern, because you know they comparatively invest an awful lot in their tech, and that was a ransomware attack, as we know. Let's come on to supply chain. Another really public example of an attack was CTS, and there's been others. Move it. Supply chain is not. I mean, there's been attacks, supply chain incidents going back years. So. And by supply chain, I mean, so, you know, obviously with CTS, the source of it actually still, as far as I know, it isn't clear. Although maybe Adam, you've got more insight than I have and I'd be interested to hear if you've got any comments on that. But obviously they are a managed service provider, which lots and lots of law firms use for, in some cases, all of their systems. So when CTS got impacted, and they had to basically shut shop for a while, and that meant that law firms didn't have access to their case management system. They didn't have access to a lot of them were no longer able to access their court system, both whether it be legal aid or whether it be the common platform. There was a very long tail of impact from that. So it's interesting. I don't know what you saw from that you can talk about, Adam, in terms of the impact that was felt from that. Or we don't have to single out CTS. Probably there's others, as I said, Move, etc.
Yeah, I think one of the key things that businesses need to do is understand, and law firms are no exception, who they're actually entrusting with what. So actually mapping out who your suppliers are, what your supply chain is, having contractual frameworks in place and having it part of your vendor selection to really assess their level of security. And that's difficult. It's particularly difficult for a small business, but at least to have those contractual obligations that you're going to get a decent level of information from a vendor if they are compromised, so you understand what's going on and you're able to act on the information you're getting. If you're left in the dark, as far as your clients are concerned, it's you who's lost their data because you selected a vendor, not that it's a third-party vendor and therefore you should be blameless. So ensuring that you're getting decent comms from your vendor is going to enable you essentially to manage this third-party incident better than you might have. And having contingencies, recognizing what those single points of failure are within your business. If this vendor that we relied upon so heavily went offline, what would the implication be, and what's our manual paper-based process or our alternative to processing or performing that work without their assistance, which I saw very, very few firms, and we helped a number of them deal with the fallout of that particular example. I saw very few firms who'd actually considered that and had a plan in place that they could enact should they lose such a key vendor for a period of time. And I think that's going to be the way that firms differentiate themselves in preparing for supply chain issues in future.
I'd be fascinated. I mean, we don't want to dwell too much on it, but I'd be fascinated in terms of contingency. I mean, it's a whole nother conversation, but it's incredibly difficult to think of a paper-based solution when you're very much online, right? Like to suddenly revert back, and particularly for the ones that do everything, if everything was hosted. Colin, did you have any thoughts on that in terms of,
Yeah, well, it's not necessarily thoughts, but this is, it's probably, if you bring in, the financial services sector, and the, the legal profession, those are probably two that would impact, the individual most, in incidents like this, whether that's, bank being breached, a simple thing like, I can't withdraw any cash, or my online banking's been removed. I can't pay, whatever that needs to be paid, and then the other one obviously is, that, I'm not saying anything that isn't that wasn't on the BBC News, for example, conveyancing transactions, completions on houses, having a real impact on individuals. So I think, both that's security, not only, from the high-end transactional, or M&A transactional activity, of your, Magic and Silver Circle firms, or, your top 100 firms. But when you get down, into the, the mid to smaller firms, this all erodes trust in the actual profession itself, when things like these happen. So, and that's probably why, the SRA are perhaps being more vocal now than was seen in previous years, because of the, the impact on this. And, I'm not saying it's bringing the profession into disrepute, but it's, it's having that, eroding the public trust, I think is probably the best way of putting it, so, all of these things are really, really vital, to ensure that Adam called out, those sort of disaster recovery, fallback plans, backup plans, whatever you want to call it, having those in place, and, maybe not putting, all eggs in one basket, so to speak.
And I do think that point about the communication is so key, having clear commitments in terms of what information you will get. Yeah, I think that's absolutely key. It's interesting you mentioned the SRA. So we're obviously talking about cybersecurity, but the other side of the coin is compliance. And I know the SRA has been very active in that space.
Mhm.
They looking at their AML report, so they found the SRA's AML report found widespread non-compliance, lack of risk assessments, inadequate AML policies, lack of training. That they said, despite firms taking their responsibilities seriously, they continue to see a significant minority of firms that don't give preventing money laundering sufficient care or attention of resources. There remain a number of firms that are still not getting the basics of their firm-wide risk assessment policies, controls, procedures, and customer due diligence right. And that the main requirements of the 2017 money laundering regulations have been in place for 6 years. There's no excuse for firms to no longer be getting the fundamentals right. And we've obviously seen law firms being fined 6-figure sums over the last year, two firms in particular. So it seems clear that that the SRA is taking this very seriously, and this is something that firms, this effectively paves the way for them to be better be prepared to prevent cyber incidents. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, I think so. If you take the whole, risk and compliance, gambit, you have cybersecurity, but those, as you called out, the AML policies, and I think, those have possibly come, more to the fore, for geopolitical reasons rather than necessarily legal reasons. Firms are being asked, where is your money coming from? Who is the end financier of a financial transaction? If you look, potentially, with the Russian invasion of Ukraine, there's a lot more attention I've seen, being paid to this, and we've seen, as a result of that, all major law firms globally, either stopping businesses entirely, closing offices, because they don't want to be associated with profiteering perhaps from one state's decisions, or where is their money coming from? And I think this is possibly, this is absolutely going to continue, but it's though having those checks in place, whether those are part of the wider client onboarding, KYC, know your customer type of activities. These are all, I genuinely do believe they're part of the one coin, because we know that, a lot of cyber attacks, emanate from certain countries, so there is that geopolitical element to all of that. But having systems in place that, either are a functional part of your practice management system, or a third party integrator into your practice management system, that your client onboarding is as robust as possible, and not continuing down, doing any work until those are, complete, or very near complete, and making sure that they are completed as soon as possible. So having those risk and, conflict checking, KYC, AML checks all in place are a really, really vital part of the wider risk and compliance arena that, a law firm really does have to consider.
Are you we're going to come on now to tech adoption, but Adam, are you, in terms of the data that law firms have and how they handle it and whether they dispose of it, etc., do you think that, I'm seeing some improvement, clients are insisting on it for a start, there's technology that enables the automatic destruction of data, are you seeing law firms handle it well, better, badly, in terms of the being on top of the data that they do have?
Definitely seeing improvements, and it is with GDPR, with them being legal professionals and having a recognition of the implications of not being compliant or not adhering to legislation. I think they probably woke up quicker than a lot of other, particularly when you think about the smaller businesses. And it's really that length of time they're keeping data for, and is it being kept for longer than necessary? And what that equates to, when I see it, is the volume of records and the amount of data for legacy clients that is being compromised as a result of a data breach. So I think there has definitely been improvements. but there's always more work that can be done. And the extent to which you find that data proliferates around environments and people are keeping copies on their computer as well as this file server and the old file server, and maybe we're keeping backups for longer than we should. It's those things that people often don't know, that they're holding on to data for the length of time that they are, and the time that they become aware is when it's been compromised and taken by a threat actor who's now extorting you on the basis that they've got a copy of it.
Yeah. Yeah, it's funny, isn't it? It's like, so someone said to me that data was used to be regarded as as like the new gold, but now it's regarded as the new nuclear waste. I was talking about cyber, only in the context of cyber activity, because obviously normally data can be a good thing if you're talking about lots of other things, but obviously having just stuff lying around in places it doesn't want to be is pretty toxic. Let's talk about like the way that firms are reacting. I suppose this comes down to a cultural thing when we're talking about technology adoption. Do you think that there is buy-in? Is there sufficient? I see this growing awareness. You know, everyone's terrified of cyber activity. With law firms, it doesn't always correlate that equals more money. I do think right now that they're under so much pressure to invest in everything. You know, you've got AI coming down the track, and are they going to pay for Copilot? Are they going to pay for the latest AI technology? But AI is also bringing new threats. You know, I think that whether they invest as well as talk about the risks is interesting. Do you think there is, you're seeing buy-in from management in terms of technology, paying for technology to address the risks appropriately?
Slowly, I think would be the, you know, as with these things often, it's very slow to move. I think a number of firms are certainly identifying that, you know, the use of AI and the use of, you know, advanced technologies is potentially a differentiator. It's a way they can manage costs. It's a way they can deliver more service to more clients in a cost-effective manner. And so these things are being looked at, but it is that, exactly as you say, that back of the mind caution, concern, hesitancy around, is that increasing the cyber risk to the business, or can and do they want to outsource work that's currently being done by people, or done by, you know, particularly people with professional qualifications, or a portion of that work? Do they want to be sharing that, splitting it out, and therefore commoditizing the service that they're providing? So I think it's going to be slow to change, but I anticipate it will march on, and we will continue to see adoption, and people will use it as a differentiator. And then those firms that haven't are going to have to play catch up.
Colin, did you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, well, I think it's as Adam said, yes. You know, the tech adoption, you know, around cybersecurity, or whether that's, you know, new ways of working, traditionally has always been slow, and or maybe not as fast as other professions, you know. But there are a few things, you know, that firms can do, you know. So and that is making sure, and it goes back to Adam's point, you know, it's just making sure that your data is in one place. There's a single source of the truth, whether that's, you know, practice case management system, your document management system, you know, but having one version of the truth. You know, keeping the data in one place, not on old servers, a backup copy over here that we know, that the only person that remembered us having it has now left the organization. That, you know, other things, you know, are you know, collaboration tools that sit within the tech stack, you know, maybe not bolt-ons, but those that have them inbuilt. You know, you're keeping them secure, and you can invite, you know, law firms can invite their clients into and collaborate in those areas, and they're therefore retaining, you know, the fidelity of that information. It's not, you know, it's not being emailed, it's not going outside. You're inviting people in a appropriate capacity, you know, whether that's they have view edit share rights or administrative rights, you know, within that. There are other things that they can be doing, is just that the software is built on a secure environment. You know, obviously the two leading ones are Azure or AWS, you know, in terms of, you know, cloud technologies. But then going back to, you know, another point that Adam made, it's, you know, to create and maintain and update, and update DR plans in line with the tech stack, and ensuring that compliance is part of that overall security. But again, I come back to, outside of that, it's educating staff is vital, and maintaining that education. It's not just educating once, making it a tick box exercise, but actually that it's something that is, updated and ongoing.
Yeah, yeah. Having that holistic strategy. Do you think that pen testing? I've written quite a bit over the years about pen testing. Is that something that you advise, Adam, in terms of that should be part of your holistic end-to-end strategy?
Yes, certainly. I think, there's implementing the controls and testing the controls. So pen testing is a key component to building out your security architecture. I think there are probably, and part of that compliance question, there are probably more firms conducting pen tests or having pen tests conducted than there are able to remedy the things that are identified. So, they might be getting a pen test once a year because that's what they're told by a particular regulation, or they have an obligation under some contract. And then they're getting the report and it's getting stuck in a desk drawer and not looked at again. At which point, in fact, it probably becomes a liability because you've now got evidence that you were told that there was something wrong with your systems that you didn't act upon 12 months, 18 months before you then had a cybersecurity incident. So while it is important, and I do think that pen tests add value, you need to employ them well, and you need to remedy the things that are identified for it to provide any real security.
Can I take you back to, so tell me a bit more about the liability. So in what senses is it a liability?
So if you imagine you've had a pen test, someone has performed a test of an application or of your network, and they've identified that there are vulnerabilities, that there are issues in the way in which you're securing it, but you don't actually have a process to remedy those vulnerabilities or remedy the things that have been identified in the test. 12 months later, you get compromised, and someone's hacked in, stolen data, dropped ransomware, whatever it may be. You're going to be in a pretty poor place from a litigation perspective if you've actually commissioned a report that listed out all these things, told you about the deficiencies, you knew about them, but you didn't act upon them prior to then having an incident that caused other people harm or inconvenience.
And presumably the regulator as well would take a very, because obviously you I forget how they describe the exact test, but you have there's a reasonable expectation of you being aware of what's happening in you're not murdering it, but you're not expected to achieve unrealistic perfection, right? Like it's what would the reasonable law firm be able to understand or know? Obviously, if you've done the exercise and you're aware of it, then that very much falls into should have remediated it, should have been aware. I hadn't, until you said that, really thought of pen testing in that way before.
Yes, I would caution though, that doesn't mean don't conduct the testing. Ignorance is not bliss. It just needs to be part of a wider program. And again, oftentimes it's the first thing that someone's thinking about improving their security. Why don't I perform a pen test and then see what's wrong and act upon it? Well, actually, why don't you perform a security review, do a load of baseline things, cover off on patching, patch management, and the basics that you can read about in any advisory that you'll see out there on how to bump up your security to the next level, and then test it from that point. And it's an iterative process of improvement. The first thing to do probably isn't testing your infrastructure.
Okay. Just going to come to some questions. So Stu Gooderham, hello, nice to see you here. With the major legal software vendors driving a cloud adoption strategy, is the ownership for security shifting away from the client to those vendors?
Happy to take the first punt at this, as it were. And I'm a consultant, so it depends. Yes and no is very genuinely the answer. And you have across all of the cloud service providers and cloud compute providers, we have a concept of the shared model of shared security responsibility, or the model of shared responsibility, whereby there are elements you expect that the service provider is keeping their systems up to date, is keeping things patched, is doing a certain amount of it for you, but it's your responsibility to ensure that good passwords are being used for those cloud applications, that you're employing the security controls such as multi-factor authentication and the things that are presented to you. If they present it but you don't enable it, then that responsibility is going to land with you. And the final one is that if they provide a facility and they provide logging that you could examine to confirm and identify a breach quickly that you could then remedy, and you're not looking at it, then they're going to hold themselves blameless. They made it available to you. It's not their job to monitor the infrastructure from a user access perspective. Maybe that's something that they expect you to do as a user of the system.
Don't know if you wanted to move on, or Colin, if you had any thoughts on
No,
that.
the only thing that I would say is, in recent contracts, the contracts are between, I know Stu's on the supplier side to law firms, the contractual commitments, are with ourselves as suppliers to the legal profession, not necessarily the end hosted provider or
Yeah.
cloud, so yeah.
So we had a question from registration. Do we expect a regulated change for the industry with security requirements on-prem solutions, MSP, SaaS providers, etc., off the back of the CTS cyber incident? And if so, what could this look like? Regulatory change, I suggest. So do we expect a regulatory change off the back of the CTS cyber incident? And if so, what could this look like? Do you think it would spark a regulatory change, that incident in particular?
I'm always one for conveying my crystal ball and making confident predictions about things that turn out to be wrong. So I think it's unlikely in this particular incident, by virtue of its scale and the nature of what happened, and to be honest, how relatively quickly people were able to recover. Yes, it was newsworthy and it had significant impact on individuals, but I don't think it's likely as a standalone incident to shift the needle on what regulators are expecting. As we see a pattern, and as we see, these things happen more and more, or more widespread impact, then certainly that may be the case. But it is fair to say, those headline-grabbing events and these major, particularly where you've got a single breach having a widespread impact because it impacted a lot of firms. Those sorts of things can potentially drive change and drive regulators to look at how they're instructing those that they regulate. Just in this case, I don't think it was necessarily enough.
Yeah. Yeah, I've got so many thoughts on that. But so yeah, so anyway, so question from registration: how do some policies affect real world work? I'm not sure I understand that question. Does anyone understand it? How some policies affect real world work? Does that mean anything to anyone? That's a question that
we could possibly interpret it about, some cybersecurity policies or compliance or risk policies, how that affects the day-to-day work of lawyers, fee earners, those that work in a law firm. I think it's one of the points that every profession deals with, and it's slowly starting to change, is that, well, this is the way that we've always done things. The only thing that's constant is change, as the saying goes. So, I think cybersecurity policies, risk compliance policies, they're there for a reason, as are, as a vendor to law firms, as are most contracts. They're there for the worst case scenario, but they're there for a reason. They're there to protect, the individual firms, the suppliers, the vendors, the professionals themselves. So yes, they will affect real world work of a law firm, but I would say that they're there to do that intentionally, and it's to reduce that risk. Yeah. So necessity is the mother of invention.
We're going to come to the last bit, which is talking about AI, the impact of AI. But there's one more question. You feel free to jump in with other questions if you want, but I'm keen to make sure that we don't miss the bit about some of the challenges that lie ahead. But Glenn, Sylvie, thanks for your question. What are your thoughts on DMARC? Maybe to Adam.
I mean, that's potentially a large topic in and of itself. I'm all
Yeah.
for it, would be the short version. So DMARC, for those who aren't aware, is a mechanism by which your messages, email messages particularly, can be authenticated. And it and DKIM are mechanisms by which you can have a greater level of trust in that an email purporting to come from someone actually did, but they have to be configured on the sender's side so that you as a recipient can then check an email that is potentially spoofed or impersonating someone else. So yes, it's something that anyone and everyone in any business should be concerned by, not least of all because, and I don't know the timeline for this, but I think if messages aren't DMARC, certainly possibly DKIM as well, configured in the next 12 to 18 months, Google and Yahoo are going to stop, treat all of them as spam and stop receiving those messages. So you're not going to have much choice about whether you implement that particular control. And it is easy and free to implement with the majority, with Microsoft 365 and the majority of other email providers. So yes, it is one of many things, but certainly not a silver bullet that helps deal with spoofed emails and some of the incidents that are impacting law firms. So all for it.
Talking about the challenges ahead. So AI, I mean, we haven't got time to talk about perhaps all of the challenges ahead, but we have got time certainly to touch on AI. If anyone wants to talk about any other challenges, just post them in the chat. I'm fascinated by this. So I know from speaking with senior people at CIOs, people at ILTA, that there's a real concern about deep fakes, the impact that AI will have in terms of really new stuff. We've been dealing with cybersecurity threats for a long time, but this is really, something new. The potential for your CEO's voice to be telling you to do something, and the kind of cultural change that will entail in the way that you train people, in the way that you just interact, and the precautions that you take. But then also, excuse me, there are ways that AI can help. So I'd be curious, but for both of you, to talk about what you think the impact of AI is going to be, perhaps touching on both of those points, and whether you think it's going to be net positive or negative. I don't mind who starts. Perhaps, I don't know, Colin, do you want to start?
Well, if you look at from the practice point of view, one of the biggest concerns, perhaps, that I've heard from firms, and some vendors have been able to overcome it, but one of the biggest concerns is how do we know that the large language models will not learn from the information that we are feeding it? So I think that's one of the biggest concerns, that obviously law firms maintain their advantage through their the IP, the knowledge of their lawyers, the data that they create for clients. We really need to be looking at vendors then that have a zero retention policy, so that the large language model does not retain any information whilst outputting results and information, but doesn't retain any of the information, so therefore cannot learn from that, and it's not shared publicly. I think
is that a security observation, or is that more of a
I'm not, well, yeah, potentially yes, but it's not necessarily bang on the the cybersecurity sort of topics that we covered here.
Yeah.
But it's about I suppose it's that for example, the information in a firm's document management system, if they're using that to feed into a large language model, how is that, going back to a point I made earlier, how is that fidelity of that information retained? And as I said, so that the large language model does not retain, cannot learn, but it's actually being able to analyze a lot of the information that already exists within your firm, within your organization, and being able to feed that back to you in a meaningful way, depending on the prompts that are used.
Yeah.
So
Sorry.
Yeah, and then I guess the other thing, is around, what parts of a law firm, what practice areas, but also, the administrative departments, how they can benefit from AI. I guess I'm looking at it from a more, positive viewpoint, the positive elements of artificial intelligence or augmented intelligence, depending on what um what way you use the letter A. So I look at it as a positive, and Adam's mentioned it before. Law firms are utilizing this to deliver legal services, legal advice, potentially in a more cost-effective way. And I'm sure Adam will come in and scare the life out of us, for the potential, negatives of that, but the negatives aren't really my area of expertise, so I'll allow
There's
Adam.
going to be a whole bunch of stuff that gets released onto the internet. There's going to be a whole load of people sharing stuff that they shouldn't be sharing. I just, I'm fascinated by the insurance position on this. I've been trying to look it up recently, whether there's any sort of advances on that. I know that there's some specific insurance for hallucination, but yeah, it's just fascinating because it's all very movable right now. But anyway, Adam, so
I do to the
yeah.
absolute minutia. I think overall, particularly from a security perspective, we're probably going to see a net positive.
Okay.
I, for one, welcome our robot overlords, and we'll continue to thank Alexa after I ask her for anything. So just in case. But you may not realize it. AI has been around for a machine learning, particularly for a very long time. The spam filters that are already doing a relatively good job of carving out a huge amount of the phishing emails and attacks that have been coming in have been using machine learning for a very long time. And the ability to spot anomalies and spot malice in an automated fashion is hopefully going to democratize information security. It's going to make it so that organizations don't have the significant cost associated with lots of security infrastructure and teams to man it and everything else that goes along with that. So the hope is that that's going to be the very significant benefit that it offers. Of course, the concept of deep fakes, the fact, just as it can democratize security, it can also lower the bar to malware authors, to people who need to and want to generate phishing messages in a language that isn't their first language. There's lots of ways in which persistent and intelligent threat actors can use and will use AI in ways that we haven't thought of yet to threaten organizations. But I imagine, bumpy road ahead as we play that cat and mouse game, and as the security controls catch up, and as the threat actors come up with new and novel attacks leveraging it. But ultimately, I hope for a net positive, as I say.
It's interesting because we've been using machine learning for a long time in terms of things like detecting whether you're sending an email to the wrong person, or for all kinds of within the email space, they're doing some really clever stuff with machine. In fact, across the board, I take your point completely. There's so many areas where you're using machine learning and have been using AI. I think with large language models, I don't, we haven't had the type of where you're putting in potentially client information to ChatGPT. That the generative, I don't think people have been interacting with generative AI in the way that they are now, and perhaps saying, right, write me a letter about this client and this client. I just wonder whether that further down the line is going to cause. It's interesting that your net positive really reassuring as well. I think that's going to cause issues that we've not come across before.
I think we're going to see some really new and interesting instance of, and it's, people say, well, we're not using AI within the business, or we're exploring using AI. There is not a business out there where junior members of staff are out trying to outsource little bits of their job with ChatGPT, or people are going rogue essentially and using these technologies in a way that isn't under the oversight of their employer. And very definitely that's a concern, and I think something that organizations need to get a grip of and get an understanding of, because that in and of itself presents a risk of potentially intellectual property or client-sensitive information being sent out of the organization to a third-party tool. Another example being, the Grammarly's of the world, which are using AI to read, review, and potentially improve the content of an email, of a Word document, but the way it's achieving that is by uploading the content of that document to a third-party service that's able to read it and, are they listed as a data processor under GDPR in your published list of people that you're sharing data with? Probably not. So it's those sorts of risks I think people are going to start waking up to relatively quickly.
Yeah. Do you mind if we take a question? So is there any trend towards law firms owning their own encryption keys and therefore controlling their data security, Adam?
Not that I've seen. I don't know if Colin might have seen that as a request from clients particularly, but generally within businesses, I'm not seeing that as a common trend across the various software as a service solutions that they're using. The overwhelming majority are kind of making the assumption, as we said, about reviewing what your third parties aren't doing, making the assumption that it's being held securely and that you can trust this third party to manage the security, including encryption keys. But Colin may have a different perspective.
I wouldn't necessarily say it's a trend, but it is absolutely there. Personally signed a contract with a well-known large law firm that insisted that they wanted to use their own encryption keys, which the system that we were providing allowed for that. So I'm not entirely sure if I would necessarily call that a trend. I would see that possibly more as an exception. I think potentially there's other sectors that may be ahead of that, especially around financial services. But it has been in my experience, it's been an exception rather than a rule. And it's tended to be the much larger firms that are insisting on bring your own key or customer managed encryption keys, CMEC. It's the larger firms because they have the resources to do that.
Yeah, typically. I think, to be honest with you, we're nearly at time. Have I forgotten to ask you anything? Is there? I mean, it's been so interesting. This is going to be. I can't wait to see what the year ahead brings. We've been talking a lot about it because it's January and we're doing all of our forecasts. We're getting our crystal balls out. We're talking about our robot overlords, as you call it, Adam. I find it really difficult to predict actually what this year is. I think this year. I was looking at some Gartner predictions for 2024, and it was interesting because they called it predictions for 2024. These were more general IT predictions, or AI generally, not necessarily in the cyberspace. But actually, a lot of the stuff that they were predicting was in 2026, right? Like, I think it would be really interesting to see what changes we see this year. But is there anything else that you wanted to share, or do you think we've covered most of it?
Nothing I can think of offhand.
No, I think the only sort of thing that I would say it's just really a reminder that where there is remediation or where audits or advice has had uncovered things to do them.
That's really
and I think that was one of the reasons why we've seen, especially around the anti-money laundering stuff specifically within the last 6 weeks. 2 stories in the press of large law firms potentially not acting on advice previously given.
Right. So that's a real big takeaway for anybody. So low-hanging fruit, check the basics, particularly around MFA, and and make sure that with the actions that you've been given that you actually do them. I think that's really valuable, and obviously everything else that we've talked about has been fascinating for me. Thank you for your questions. Thank you for your thanks just now. Really interesting talking to you. I really appreciate it. This will be available on recording, and look forward to catching up again.
Thanks, Caroline. Thanks, Adam.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, everyone, for listening in.
Thank you.
Appreciate it.